Hello and welcome to part 13 of our Building a Node Express and Postgres based API. Today we're going to run through continuation of our user creation endpoint, and what we're going to do is we're going to write some unit tests to cover the routes and the route endpoints that we created in the last video. And we're also going to add what's known as an asynchronous wrapper, which is a piece of code that's going to go around our routes functions here and just wrap these so that because they're asynchronous piece of code, any errors that are thrown from within them don't currently get picked up very nicely and passed along to our error handling middleware. So we're going to need to write a small piece of helper code that will just wrap those and make sure they get passed along to our error handling middleware that we've got set up here. To give you an idea of what it is that's happening at the moment is I'll just do npm run dev, we'll start up our server. And what we'll do is we'll just head over to Postman and we'll just do a quick post request to our user's endpoint. And what we'll actually get is we don't even get an error response, we just get the socket hung up, which is typically an indication that an application has crashed unexpectedly. So we'll head over and we can see what's happened is we've got HTTP error, and it's come back saying first name, last name, email and password is required, which is kind of what we're expecting of our endpoint because we haven't actually passed it a body object. But what it's done is instead of capturing it properly, it's led to an unhandled exception within our application, which has caused it to crash. So what we'll do is we'll actually write a piece of code that's just going to wrap our route functions and make sure that if any exceptions are thrown from within here, like a validation error, that they get gracefully passed along to the middleware within Express. So what we're going to do is we'll just add a new function to our utils here, which is going to be called async-wrap.js. It's going to contain one function, which is just going to be called async wrap. And what that is going to take is a function, which is going to be essentially this function here. And what it's responsible for doing is actually returning an instance, returning that function called, but wrapped within a promise that can be have any exceptions that are thrown caught within it. And how that looks is we'll actually return a function with the express middleware, express parameters in it, rec, res, and next. And then from within there, we'll return the function called, and we'll pass in the context, so this, and then we'll pass in rec, res, next, and then we'll do a .catch and next. And what this will do is when this function is called, when this async wrapped function is called, it'll call the underlying function and it'll wrap it so that any errors that are thrown from within it are caught and passed on to this next middleware, next function. And the next function, when it's called with an error, will pass it down the chain to our error handling middleware, which will happen here. So after our route gets called, there's an error that's thrown. The next middleware to be called will be this HTTP error response handler, which will pick up our errors and it'll wrap them nicely and it'll put them in an instance of HTTP error and send a nice status code back to the front end for us. So what we'll do is we'll just do module.exports and then we'll just pass out the async wrap. And all that we need to do to actually make use of this now is just go into here, require the async wrap function, so we'll just require it up the top here, and wrap our user's endpoint, wait for our application to restart, which it does, and then we can head back over to Postman, make the same request again, but this time we actually have a good response back to the front end. We've got a 400 status code, which is nice, so that's a status code that we defined, and the contents of the message are that all of these validation errors occurred. So that means that we can pass that on to the front-end application that this API serves, and it'll be able to display these errors to a user so they can do something about them. So that's what an async wrapper does and looks like. And what we'll do is we'll just add a quick unit test. Oops, we need to do .unit.test.js. And from all we need to do here is just write a couple of, well, one simple test really. Just import the async wrap. Equals require async wrap. And then we'll just grab our before each piece of code that resets all of our mocks before each call. And we'll just do describe the file that we're testing. A describe block for the function that we're testing, async wrap. And then we'll create a test for it. Test. And then what we'll do is just say wraps and calls an async function with a catch. Oops, there we go. So what we're going to do, there's a couple of things that we're going to want to work on. First is we're going to want to mock out this function. We're also going to want to mock out this catch so that we can check to make sure this catch is actually called so that the async function will correctly pass things onto our middleware. So what we'll do is we'll add a catch spy, and that's just going to be a jest function that we can listen to or inspect. And then we'll add a function spy, which is a jest function.mock return value, and that's going to return a catch, which will be the catch spy. So what that'll do is that'll just make sure that this function here, when it's called, will return a catch which can be chained upon, which is just how this would work in the real world. So we've got that there, and then what we need to do, we'll do wrapped function equals async wrap function spy. So we'll wrap our test function within our async wrapper, and then we'll listen to the response of this, which is essentially invoking our wrapped function. And what we want to do is we want to pass in options for the three parameters that our function is expecting, which is a request, a response, and a next function. So we'll just make sure that gets passed in properly. What we're expecting is, firstly, that this wrapped function is something that's defined. So when this async wrap is called, we're expecting this to be an entity and not something that's undefined. So we'll just do expect wrapped function dot to be defined. So it's not like undefined or anything like that. And then what we'll do is expect res dot to be undefined, because the actual function itself doesn't return anything. What we'll do is we'll expect function spy dot to have been called. So what that means is when this wrapped function, when the response is invoked from the wrap function, we're actually expecting the underlying function to have been called. What we're also expecting is that the catch chain has also been called as well, so that it makes sure that if there is anything that's thrown within that calling function, that it gets picked up by the next middleware. So that's what we're expecting to happen. So let's run the unit tests. Run unit test. Test. Oh, we got some stuff that's failing here. So describe test. Oh, I didn't save the file. That's my bad. So we should have. Okay, we've got one thing that's failing. And it's actually something that's failed from our last video. Let's go and have a look. So what it's saying is router is not a function, and it's within the HTTP server middleware here. So what's going to be happening is within here we mock out express, which is what we need to do to get these tests to work okay. But because we're not mocking out this user router, when we look at user routers here, is trying to call router, which is expected to be available on Express, but because we're mocking it out, it's not. So there's quite a simple way of getting around this, and that is we can mock out the user router. So let's do that. Jest.mock user routes, and what that's going to return is a user router. We'll just call that jest.fn. We'll just do that. And what that should do is mock that out so that it doesn't actually try to invoke Express itself anymore, and that should lead us to a passing test. So a small aside there, but if we go back to our async wrap, we've now got async wrap unit tests which cover the expected behavior that happens within our wrapper here, which is great. So we've covered off the adding an async wrapper, and what we'll do now is we'll look at writing a unit test for our user routes. So we've only got one user route at the moment, which is the create user. So I'll write some unit tests that will check if this validate throw throws an error, that it gets thrown properly. If this validate throw doesn't throw an error, then this handler is called and this res.json is called as well. So let's go ahead and do routes.unit.test.js, and then we'll get started on our user routes unit tests. What those are going to look like is we will first of all require Express, because we're going to need that to create a router for us. Require Express. Then we're going to want user router equals require routes. I don't actually think that's exported yet, so we'll just export user router. Because what we're going to want to do when we're testing this is we're actually going to want to create our own user router instance just for the purpose of testing. So we'll export that user router just for the purpose of testing here. And then what we'll do is we'll mock out the handlers, because we don't want those to actually do anything. And then we'll just also grab our before each block, copy and paste that over, and then we'll get to start describing what it is that we're going to be testing. So we're going to be testing the routes. Within routes, we're going to be testing user router, and then we're going to go another describe block further as well, and we're going to be saying the function that we're going to be testing is create user. And then we'll be able to write our tests in here. But for the moment, what we're going to do is, because we need a user router to actually call our tests from, we'll create our user router here. New user router, user router, and then we'll call this we'll just do express.router, because it's expecting an express router to be passed into its constructor. So we know that we're going to have two test scenarios that we want to do. So we'll write the first one, which is going to be test throws an error if a required property is not present in the request. So what that means is, if for some reason we're missing a property from the user pass from the front end, we want to make sure that it's actually going to throw an error. So what we'll do is we'll just create the user that we're going to want to mock, and we know that they're going to have a first name, John, last name, Doe, email, john.doe@test.com. And then what we'll do is we'll purposefully leave off the password so that that's the piece that's going to be validated or fail validation. What we need to do now is we need to mock out the request object that's going to go into the function, and the body of that is going to be the user. we're going to want to mock out the response object as well, and the response object is responsible for dealing with this res.json. So what we'll do here is we'll add a JSON spy, which will allow us to check whether that JSON function is called, and then we'll add the res, which will be this, would just be an object with a JSON, which is going to be the JSON spy, and then we can do expect user router create user request response dot rejects dot to throw rejects dot to throw error, and it'll be something like password is required. That's what I think it's going to be anyway. Let's run our unit tests and see how this goes. So we've got the where is it? No, it's the routes.unit.test.js. Okay, for some reason those don't seem to be coming up. We'll do. Oh no, there they are. So throws an error if a required property is not present in the request. What I'm going to do, I'm just going to change this because I want to see that that's actually throwing the expected error that we're expecting as well, and it is. So password is required. So that shows that we've got a test that successfully throws an error if this validate throw is called, which is great. And now what we'll do is we'll add a function, we'll add a test that asserts that it all passes okay, and that the correct function, so the handler and the res.json are called as well. So we'll just add a dummy password here that will pass our constraints. We'll make this an asynchronous check. Because what we'll want to do is we'll say const user create response equals await create user request response, and then what we'll do is we'll say expect user create response dot to be undefined. And the reason for that is in these root handlers here, nothing's actually ever returned from this, so there'll actually just be an undefined that's returned at the end. What we'll also want is expect JSON spy dot to have been called, and then we'll do another expect, which is going to be require handlers dot user handlers dot create user dot to have been called with the request, and then we'll yeah, I think that should be it. So what we're expecting is this create user is called with this request, JSON is called, and the response should be undefined. What we'll do is, just while we're here, I'll just add in a check here that says that in this particular test, the JSON spy should never be called, and that will mean that in the future, if for some reason this validate throw code is changed and it no longer throws an error, which is probably not what it's expected to do, then this test will fail and it'll catch that kind of edge case as well. So let's run our unit test again and see where we end up. Oh, we've got a failure here. Let's have a look. Create user is not defined. Oops, yes, it's not. User router dot create user. That's correct. Still got a failing test. User router dot create user. That's correct. It should be a lowercase u, as it's actually the instance of the user router. So I'll run that one again. Excellent, and we've got 22 passing tests. We've got full test coverage over everything, but most importantly, we've got tests now that assert that in the event of a validation failure, we are getting a nice error that's thrown. And also in the event that it all passes, then these different functions are called with the expected arguments. What you can do if you want to further strengthen your tests is you can add in individual tests for each of the required properties here, just to make sure that they all pass. So I just mean adding an additional 3 tests here, one that's just missing the email, just missing the last name, just missing the first name, and just asserting that those are done okay. But for what we need to do at the moment, I think this is going to be suitable. What we'll do in the next video is we'll have a look at starting our service and actually sending a bunch of data at it using something like Postman, just to then be able to go and check that those bits of data have actually made it into the Postgres database that we're expecting as well. But once you're up to this point and you've got all the tests passing, you should be good to go, and I will see you in the next video.